Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Beyond the EHR Clinical Trials in the Age of Abundant Data. My name is Aisha Rashid, and I will be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we will try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Eligo, who developed the content for this presentation. Eligo Health Research accelerates clinical trials through healthcare with access to over 150 million known patients and their HIPAA-compliant healthcare data. The company's Intelligo Research Stack technology and patient select identification and engagement model. Coupled with the largest known patient access network, Eligo's site solutions enable healthcare practices and research sites to participate in clinical trials. By adaptive engagement of known patients and physicians, Eligo accelerates the development of new pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device and diagnostic products. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event. Michael Ibarra has more than 20 years of experience in clinical research and development. Throughout his career, Michael has sought to improve healthcare by bringing together healthcare data and digital technologies. His interests include regulatory and policy implications for digital healthcare, exploring the factors needed to allow interoperability of healthcare data for all stakeholders involved, and implications for the use of big data, machine learning, and natural language processing to improve our ability to perform regulated clinical research. Before joining Eligo, Michael Ibarra was the head of digital healthcare for the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium, or CDISC. There, he led the US FDA eSource project and healthcare link efforts with registries, clinical trials, and mobile health to enable use of real-world data from healthcare for regulated research and decision-making. Prior to CDISC, Michael was head of business development coordination and innovation and also head of pharmacovigilance innovation at Pfizer, where he worked for 15 years in various positions, leading implementations of global systems and large-scale technologies. Michael Fronston joined the organization in 2005 and currently leads the clinical, regulatory, and safety team at Cerner and Visa, formerly Cantor Health. Michael's team is responsible for delivering high-quality, regulatory-grade work to support pre- and peri-approval clinical research and post-approval safety surveillance. The clinical, regulatory, and safety team also leads the global harm reduction partnerships and separately public health partnerships in Germany. In addition to overseeing the global team, Michael's accountable for supporting corporate development and product innovation. Michael's prior roles include Global Health of Offer and Innovation, General Manager of the Real World Evidence Group, Chief Operating Officer, and Head of Life Sciences Business Development. Prior to joining Cerner and Visa, he held various leadership roles spanning industry, payer, and consulting organizations. Michael is a member of the Cerner and Visa leadership team and is proud to serve as a board member for International Guardian Limited. Michael earned a Master of Business Administration from the University of Miami with a certification in healthcare administration. He has a bachelor's degree in sociology from the State University of New York at Albany. Seth Hopkins is Executive Director, Translational Medicine at Synovian Pharmaceuticals, and in his work at Synovian, he has led and advanced new treatments for CNS disorders from discovery through to regulatory submissions. Prior to his role in translational medicine, Seth has served in a variety of roles, including computational chemistry, pharmacology, preclinical, and clinical development. During his tenure, he has advanced programs through clinical development, applying clinical pharmacology, experimental medicine, neuroimaging, modeling, and simulations. At Synovian, his current research interest is in the application of advanced mathematics and analytics to improve the efficiency of clinical development of breakthrough treatments for psychiatric disorders. Seth was a key contributor to the initiation, clinical development, and submission of INDs and NDAs in psychiatric indications. Seth completed his postdoctoral training at University of California, San Francisco, and his PhD in biophysics from the University of Pennsylvania. With over 20 years of experience in business, technology, and innovation leadership, Doug Lee has emerged as a change agent. Through precise strategy and dynamic culture development, Doug has demonstrated the ability to help businesses weaponize their data to drive top-line growth and profitability. In his role as Vice President, Operations and Chief Data Officer, Doug is responsible for data strategy, data commercialization, innovation, and operational excellence. He is active in related professional organizations, serving on various boards within the private and public sectors. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to our speakers. You may begin when ready.
Thanks very much, Aisha. I'm Michael Ibarra, and thanks to everyone for attending this webinar. This is a fascinating webinar to me personally. I work with all of our speakers here, and when you look at the breadth of what we have, this is what it takes to run clinical research these days, I think. You know, I think there are several epochs in the history of using EHRs. I remember years back when they first were introduced, when I learned about them from the industry side, I thought, this can be a great boon to clinical research. But at the time, you know, I think a lot of us thought of it as sort of like hooking up one machine to another, and that's going to get us where we need to go. And then we started to realize, you know, interoperability is much harder than we realized. And so we started working on that, and then we realized, well, we need to get all of the data together because we have to standardize it, do a lot of things to it before it can work. So we started collecting large amounts of data. And then to our surprise again, which I suppose we shouldn't have been surprised, collecting all the data in one place didn't necessarily do it, because now we all have collections of data, and so they're normalized within their own silo. But a fascinating thing has happened in the last several years that I've seen in clinical research. Whereas I thought we would basically be solving more and more of it, as clinical research has progressed, we have a two-sided problem. We have much more specific requirements to go after specific populations, because the drugs today are able to target more specific conditions and populations of patients. So we're finding smaller numbers of patients that we need to find more specifically. And at the same time, we've got studies running across thousands, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 patients where we need the volume. So amazingly, we end up with a continuing need to find more patients for trials. And I believe that this will be an ongoing trend. And so this panel represents the types of relationships that I think we need to bring together. No one group can really do it anymore. So we've got folks representing, you know, development of an individual EHR and bringing the sites in for that. We've got individual companies holding many EHRs. We've got sponsors working on leveraging EHRs, and Elego has a relationship with all these folks. And what it shows me personally is the old adage, you know, when you digitize a field, you sort of bring everybody into the same room. And that's what I think we're doing today. That's what this represents. So we're, besides talking about using an EHR, how do you really then use the data to still place your patients into trials and improve your trials? So that's what we're about today. And we're going to go through each speaker has a little bit to say on that, and then we can open it up for discussion and Q&A. So I'd like to start with you, Michael, and from the perspective of Cerner having a single EHR and developing that and developing a learning health network, your perspectives on the topic.
Great, thanks, Michael. And first, let me say thank you to you and to Eligo for inviting me to join you in this discussion, and to X Talks. And I'm humbled to be with such other great people and speakers here. What backgrounds, huh? Wow. The age of abundant data on that first slide. We are not lacking in data, that is for sure. Getting to the data is the challenge, right? And ex-US, it's even more difficult, especially when it comes to electronic health record data. But here, where do you start, right? From an EHR perspective, if you want to get the data, have it harmonized, curated, and appropriate, fit for purpose, if you will, to use it for a clinical trial. There are 200 to 300, I think, EHR systems in the US. There are aggregators, there are other sources that you can go to and partners. So you have to first start out by saying, where do I go? Which EHR? Next, please. So, and often it starts with healthcare systems or multiple healthcare systems to form a health network or a learning health network, as Michael, you had mentioned. And that's not an easy task to do. There's a lot of considerations around these networks. What do they represent? What is their heterogeneity? What do they look like? It's obviously all US right now because of GDPR. You can't get to the EHRs in Europe, or it's very difficult to, if you will. So you have to start determining, where do I go and how do I get there as a starting point. Next. And then, really what you're looking for is for them to provide data rights to their EHR to you so you could use it. But then the data is very messy. It was not set up for research purposes or to identify the populations that are intended to be enrolled in clinical trials. So there's a lot of challenges here, but why would they give you data rights? Why would they give that to you? It's their bread and butter, their gold mine, if you will. So next slide. So what is it that they're going to get in return? You have to determine that up front. You got to talk to them about it, negotiate, and find out what's important to them. Is it bringing back clinical trials to them? Is it access to de-identified data across the entire network, if it is a multi-healthcare system network? And that will vary depending on what the health system you're looking at. If you're looking at a small community hospital who's never done clinical trials or research in the past, their incentives are very different from an academic medical center or some large independent delivery network. So you really have to have conversations to determine what do they want to get in return. Next slide, please. So once you figure all that out, right, and they do provide data rights to you, and you've now cleaned the data, organized the data, de-identify the data, and there's a boatload of steps that are occurring during this process, then you can start to understand the population that you want to include in your clinical trials. And of course, the inclusion and exclusion criteria is critically important. And life science and medical device companies and genomic companies, they're all going to tweak and massage their I&E criteria, relax it or make it more rigid depending on what they want and what they're studying and so forth and so on. Next slide, please. So, but before you even dig into that next step of the EHR data specifically, we really need to take a step back and understand the patient's voice, right? We've seen the FDA in particular talking a lot about patient-centric clinical trials. We talk a lot about patient experience and patient voice. And if clinical trials don't objectively measure what's important to patients, caregivers, their families, then perhaps it's not serving its purpose. So a lack of understanding of the patient's specific needs, their priorities, the experiencing that they're living every day based on their disease, the lack of understanding can really negatively impact the clinical trials and the results, and it could result in worse or lengthened enrollment periods, retention, recruitment, lots of amendments, and it really could just derail your clinical trial. So this is really important to understand these things, so then you can dive into the EHR or whatever data set you're using to reflect and find what's important or most important to the patients, caregivers, and their families. Next, please. So now we start delving into the EHR data. And there are so many different ways that you can leverage the data to help establish what your clinical trial protocol is going to look like. You see diversity, feasibility, and enrollment goals are just three of many things that I've listed here. And diversity on top, there's been two sets of guidance rolled out by the FDA a couple years ago and most recently in April. And diversity is everything from social determinants of health and demographics and race and ethnicity to things like comorbidities and disability and transplant patients and where are they located from a geographical perspective. It used to be that we were only doing clinical trials in the largest cities, but really diversity and health equity is getting to not just the underserved populations who may not have access, but those who don't have access because they're just not in the proximity of a site, if you will. And then using the EHR for protocol optimization and feasibility to understand what can we do out there, and not even knowing necessarily if some of these patients are already enrolled in a clinical trial, and therefore the feasibility may be worse than we're led to believe based on the data. And then last, enrollment goals. You would use all this information to set up what your enrollment goals would look like based on some stratification of all these variables. So you have targets that represent the disease itself and not necessarily just the US Census, because certainly in certain diseases, it will occur in a disproportionate way to some specific group of people. Once you do all that, then you look in the EHR to identify the patients. And when I say identify, what I mean is where are they located? How do we get to them so we could start enrolling them into our clinical trials and activate them, if you will, into the trial itself. And next, please. To do that, then, you need to start site activation. You go out to those sites back at that same healthcare system where you've identified these eligible patients based on the I&E criteria, and you start working with these systems. And again, based on the system itself and whether it's an academic center or a community health center, an IDN, or so forth and so on, they may or may not have done research in the past. And that's where it's important to have partners like Eligo at your side to help you get this done in some of these research naive settings. So next slide, please. So I say the importance of partnerships, and I have some shadows here, because at each of these steps, having the right partners with the right experiences is going to make your jobs and lives either easier or harder or set you up for success. And now we're in a position where, we need to accelerate clinical trials in a way, or recruitment into clinical trials in a way with the right patients so that we can get these newer treatments into the hands of the people that need it the most, especially when you think about rare diseases and oncology. So it's important to have partners every step of the way and to think about that. And then the last thing I'll say, how does this come to life? Next slide, please. And here's a real example. And you can build it to the next slide there. So keep going if you will, please, Aisha. Thank you. So here's a real example and a way that we're working with Eligo. So you see the title says increased access to real world data can provide earlier access to clinical trials. And in this case, Eligo and Cerner and Visa, leveraging the partnerships that I just described in the Learning Health Network at Cerner, we're working with the multi-omics company, Freenome. And this has just been released in a press release. So this is all public information. And the idea here is that we use the EHR data to identify newly diagnosed cancer patients, and then working with Eligo, and working on behalf of the sites, we reach out to these patients before they get their first treatment to enroll them into the clinical trial so they can get a blood draw. If you think about it, you have a very short window to do this, to get in there. And working with the EHR data, not only are you able to identify who the appropriate patients are in real time, depending how you access the data and the rights that you have, but you're also able to leverage certain aspects of the EHR data where we can see their appointment schedule and call up the patient, say, I'm calling on behalf of Dr. So-and-so, and I see you're scheduled for your next appointment in 2 weeks or whatever it is. So really the utilization of EHRs to help accelerate this enrollment is really fascinating, and it's really come a really long way, and it's leverageable if you know how to leverage it. So this is a real story, and we've already started enrolling our first few patients this month, the beginning of this month, and it's going to be great. So just the last slide here, if you will, Aisha. Here's my email information for any questions after the webinar. And with that, let me pass it back to Michael, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Michael. You laid out a great roadmap for EHR to clinical trials and the experience and things like that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, Doug, if you could address starting the challenges of starting a company within a company with a wide variety of EHRs and data stores and things, and then realizing that you want to bring clinical research to that sort of research naive population.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'll take a huge step back. I'm a part of Constellation Software, and that's our parent company. And then we have Harris Computer, which is the next layer. My company is a startup within Harris Computer called Sidus Insights. Our brief is to, as Michael suggested, is to take a network of EHRs that has EHR data and inpatient data, and how do we pull it together into a central store? How do we gain insights from it, and how do we enable clinical research as well? So it's been a long journey. It's been 16 months since we first started. We had to jump through a lot of hoops. Of course, it all started with the legal, regulatory, privacy, and security. We've had a lot of, it started out with a lot of conversations there, but with our sister business units as well. So Michael touched on data rights earlier, and data rights in this case, we were stuck. Do our EHRs have data rights from their providers? So there was that extra step that we need to have in place as well in order to make our legal teams happy. But at the same time, we also looked at how do we build a system that we could take all these disparate EHR data and inpatient data, and how do we pull it into a platform that made sense and that we could use compute capabilities to be able to have high performance. So we ran a bunch of POCs, and at the end of the day, we ended up with a platform that was 12,000% higher performing than our previous one. So to quantify that, it was one data set took 5 days to run around the clock, and the same data set took 45 minutes. So we definitely found something there. But from that, the hard part really started, right? We had to standardize the data, we had to transform the data, and we had to normalize the data. So we had a master data model. We thought that, OMOP, FHIR, et cetera, was too narrow. So we want to make sure that we didn't, we preserve data utility as much as possible. So we use as wide, we cast a wide net. And we created our own master data model that we had a little bit of everything from each data source. right? So each AHR, maybe it's good to cover that off. So each AHR records their data differently, and there's no global standard out there. So as there is a lot of noise. So the cleansing, the standardization, the transformation was huge for us because we were trying to get everybody to speak the same language. At the end of the day, there was de-identification that we built in-house, and we worked really hard. It took us over a year to run it through expert determination. So we have our expert determination certification for all of our unstructured and structured data sets. And ultimately, the goal was to pull together a longitudinal view of patient X. And, it doesn't matter if they went to this EHR or that EHR within our network. We wanted to make sure that we could tell a story, right? And usually the story is between 15 to 20 years, which is a pretty good view of a patient. And from that, the last problem to solve was really just data share at the end of the day. So how do we look at that problem? There's a few different ways that we looked at that problem, and we have a few different solutions in place. But one of them I'm most proud of is working with Michael at Eligo and being able to have a direct share with Michael, so Michael's team can have a view of the data. So when we share the data to them, it's a live view. And for his team to be able to run queries directly on that data set was huge. So I'm most proud about that. It's just a way for us to, again, it's a way for us to enable clinical research and our partners.
Thanks very much, Doug. And thank you for speaking to a topic near and dear to my heart, which is the heterogeneous EHR environment in the US, honestly. This is usually, for clinical folks who are starting a trial and they want to use an EHR, the last thing you think about is the thing that stops you dead in the water, which is, oh, we can't merge the data, we need to clean it, or we need to standardize and things like that. And you guys have done all of that to such a large extent of data. It's very impressive, and I really like so far, just in what you've heard from Michael and Doug, the sort of doing the trial is the tip of the iceberg, and everything underneath there to use the EHRs is a tremendous amount of work. And so our next speaker, honestly, I think is a great testimony to why would we want to do all this. And I'm very excited, Seth, about what you have to talk about in terms of showing that there is a payoff at the end in trying to use medical records. So I'll turn it over to you, Seth.
Seth, I believe you're on mute, so if you could unmute yourself.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Doug. So I want to focus on some data. I want to show you some actual clinical trial data and some approaches we're taking to incorporate medical records in the conduct of phase 3 regulatory FDA adequate and well-controlled trials for registration of new drugs. Next slide, Alyssa. So I think Michael had talked about we're in this epoch of no one group can do it alone anymore. So when we thought about our phase 3 programs in psychiatry, we realized that particularly in the United States, our clinical trials can be more efficient. We've seen in the United States an erosion of drug signal. What I mean by that is this notion of a clinical trial effect, or you can think of a placebo response, an inability to detect if a drug is active against comparison to placebo. So by no one group, I mean we've focused on subject eligibility. I think Michael Fronstein pointed to that as well. And I'm dividing subject eligibility across kind of three domains. One is around symptom presentation. One is around medical history, which is where the medical records come in. And the other is around the infrastructure or the patient population that shows up for our clinical trials, particularly in the United States, where there are business incentives that are influencing the study population where we can use, where we study our drug effects. So next slide. One of the key guidances that we've focused on, particularly around erosion of drug signal, is an enrichment guidance issued by the FDA. One of the first elements of that is around defining entry criteria carefully to ensure that enrolled patients actually have the disease that is being studied. I want to take you through some recent data that we've published around that erosion, particularly in subjects who are lacking a medical record and objective verified documentation of their condition. Next slide. So we're studying psychiatry and in particular bipolar depression. This was a phase 2 study where we're measuring over the course of 6 weeks improvement in total symptoms in depression, and the scale we use is called MADRS. And what I'm showing you is the intent to treat population, the 337 subjects entering the trial, and look at the change in symptoms. So I'm marking those dashed lines around 12-point change versus around 18-point change. That's the window in which we can detect drug effects across all compounds that have been developed in depression for the last 15 years. And when placebo change is greater than that top dashed line around minus 12 points, it's a ceiling effect. We've suppressed our ability to detect drug-placebo separation. This trial does have an effect size shown there of about 0.3 and was able to show a separation, but you can see that the effect size is relatively small, meaning that clinical trials dedicated to show drug-placebo separation need to be very large, which is not an efficient way to develop new treatments for patients that need them. We noticed, though, in particularly the United States, that there's a fraction of the subjects that did not have medical records that could document that these patients had a diagnosis of bipolar depression and that were currently experiencing depression prior to entering the trial. So once they enter the trial, the assessments are all very thorough. However, we rely on the investigator and the patient and the volunteer to portray their prior medical history. So next slide. So we separated out those subjects without medical records from those that had, supporting their diagnosis. Next slide. And so in the bottom curve, look at what happens to the subjects who come in who didn't have medical records. That's a placebo curve where the change on placebo is enormous. So it's difficult to detect any drug-related improvement when all the subjects are getting better. Next slide. And the placebo change for those that had documentation of their diagnosis and medical records was much more modest. You can see there around 12 points. Next slide. So that then the drug effect in the top panel is now almost 0.5. That means clinical trials can be smaller, more efficient, and drugs can be approved more effectively. And in the bottom panel, in the 50 subjects that didn't have medical records, the overall change, even on the drug, was very high. Next slide. So going back to this enrichment guidance that is sort of a very important way to communicate the design of our trials and the appropriateness and adequacy for regulatory submission was by making reference to this guidance. So one of the ways to improve drug signal is to decrease heterogeneity of study entry. That increases the efficiency of drug development. It selects a study population for which the potential effect can be more readily demonstrated. And in general, it's not considered to alter the statistical validity of the conclusions. Next slide. So I just want to take a few moments to talk about an approach that we've taken recently in psychiatry trials, and then I'll come back and relate it to sort of the infrastructure and patient population. So traditionally, when we write inclusion criteria in our trials, we talk about symptom severity. We want to be able to detect the drug effect in a population that have relatively severe symptoms. In psychiatry, that means relatively disabled by their symptoms. In this guidance, the FDA describes how there's 3 strategies. One is to decrease variability. And I think I showed you an example of that where in those patients that didn't have medical records, there really was a prompt resolution of symptoms. They improved spontaneously. Another 2 strategies around prognostic enrichment. So this is ways to find subjects who have more likelihood of presenting with a disease-related endpoint, if it's an event-driven study, or have substantial worsening in condition. And then the last one is the holy grail around predictive enrichment strategies. Here where you have an additional measure, some aspect of the patient's physiology that's related in some manner to the drug's mechanism. And that's an approach that would ultimately shift benefit risk by identifying a marker in a patient. That's what this concept of right patient, right drug comes from. Next slide. So this gets back to kind of what Doug was talking about. Inside of a drug company, we have a very large collection of clinical observations from our clinical trials, which have been standardized. We collect clinical observations under very regulated conditions. And so we looked back in our data sets of the past 15 years of trials in psychiatry and decided we could approach heterogeneity around patient type that would help in the prospective use of inclusion criteria that wouldn't just be around symptom severity, but around symptom structure. Next slide. So what you're looking at on the next slide is the constellation of symptoms in schizophrenia. So this is acute schizophrenia. We had run 13 studies, which are 4 to 6 weeks long in the hospital. We had almost 5,000 subjects at baseline. These are the 30 symptoms of the scale that is used to register new treatments for schizophrenia. Each symptom is a node, and their relatedness is the lines between them or the edges. And they're organized around symptoms that are positive, disorganized, negative, hostile, or affective symptoms. And we want to develop and describe the effects of novel treatments on the constellation of symptoms. But in this heterogeneous population, it's very difficult to assess. Next slide. So we've discovered ways to prognostically enrich for particular patient types defined by a constellation of negative symptoms, for example, shown here. So on the left-hand side, we found approximately 1/4 to 1/5 of our patients had a very coherent community of symptoms in their disorder, which could be more readily measured with our existing scales. And on the right-hand side, these are the heterogeneous patients in which those measurements would be less reliable. And so we're working on inclusion criteria to go and enroll subjects where the endpoints can be more reliably measured. Next slide. And that's where electronic health records are very important. This approach, I'll skip these next 2 slides. This approach can be applied in other psychiatric disorders, particularly in depression. And we can enrich for symptom presentation in various psychiatric disorders. So on the left-hand side of this 3 kind of no one approach can do it alone, we have this concept of enrichment, where symptom presentation and medical records go hand in hand. Next slide. Around eligibility. And then on the right-hand side, it's around access to clinical research as care, which gets to the patient population and infrastructure. So then I'll just go to the next slide. So some of the uses of medical records from our perspective to improve clinical trials is really around the documentation of the inclusion-exclusion criteria and the confidence in the diagnosis and the presentation of symptoms. That actually can reduce time in screening. Incidentally, in the United States, we've noticed this phenomenon where we screen far more subjects relative to those that get enrolled than outside of the United States. And so there's a business incentive that's influencing how we enroll our patient population. So the medical records can provide a more comprehensive approach to eligibility in our protocols. Our protocols can ensure against inappropriate subjects being enrolled if we can access and incorporate that data. Overall, when we develop drugs, we need to very carefully describe safety in terms of adverse events and early terminations. And for that reason, the inclusion criteria is very important around enrolling the appropriate subjects that warrant treatment and warrant participation in a research study. And the medical records help there. And ultimately, the efficacy signal, I think I've shown you, can be improved by reducing heterogeneity, and that requires access to patient history and their medical records. So I'll end it there. Thank you. Back over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Seth. As I mentioned before, I think this is tremendously exciting. You showing, sort of drawing a straight line from the use of, record-based information, which is more factual, to impact on efficacy, which is just, like I said, that's the payoff for all of us in talking about all this. So thanks very much for that. So from my point of view, I'm Chief Data Officer at Elego. The speakers that have gone before so far are all part of my journey in what we've been working on at Elego. And Elego's business model is to bring clinical research into healthcare and to those sites that may be naive or need help with that, and patients in healthcare, to make it part of healthcare. But because of that, the emphasis, and the focus is standing up the research infrastructure at a site, let's say. And so what is the role of working with data and data science in that organization? My remit is to get value from the data that we do, and the value is defined as bringing a patient into a trial, right? So I've been at Elego 4 years now. The difference between when I started until now, I've learned two major lessons, I think. And the first is the topic of this webinar, which is you need to form partnerships in order to execute research in today's world, I think. And you heard from Michael and Doug the number of challenges that they have to go through just focused on the data long before you try and bring it to clinical research. And as I said, this is typically sort of the part of the iceberg that you don't see, that's underwater. And so we want to stand up research at a site. Well, there's 100 things to be done before that, and it can take up 90% of the attention of a data partner, as we would call it, of Cerner, of Harris and CITUS. So the first thing my group had to do was learn how to work with other groups. In addition to, if you're a data science group, in addition to looking at analysis and things like that of the data, we had to learn not just our own data, but learn our data partners' data, because we need to make it as easy as possible for them so that they can concentrate on what they have to do. They have so much to do just in working with the data. Now, we want to stand up clinical research. So what I found, to my surprise, is that data science becomes a link between partnering for the data and executing on the final product, as it were, which is getting a patient into a trial. You heard Doug talk about the fact that we have direct access into their de-identified data. We have the same thing with Cerner. And that's hours and hours of discussion and work and understanding history of the data, the way it's set up, the data rights, as Michael mentioned, the operating principles in both companies, and the endpoint where we want to go. And in addition, working out the process and the cycle time, because as you know, standing up something, getting a query out, understanding the protocol, all of that moves at a very accelerated pace these days. So very quickly, we switched data science into a collaborative group where we're working as much outside as inside the organization, and that was a lesson for me, to the way I needed to set up the group. The second lesson has been more recent, but that's about I think there's a general shift from sort of a primary population approach to finding patients, for example, to more of a precision approach, to coin the term from precision medicine, where we're finding records at a patient level. So a lot of us, for a while now, a few years, we find patients going across a large number of medical records, and hence the reason to partner. And you find that at a population level, and then you have the individual patients to look at. But now there's increasing need, I think, to find all of the records for any given patient. And I think Seth and Synovion is a great example of that. For us, I realized we have to create a turnkey sort of operation to do that. For any given patient at an individual level, let's find all of the records associated for that patient. And so we set up a service, and if you're familiar with it, there's no one way to get all the medical records for a single patient. And many times they may come in a PDF format. So you can't search those very easily at all. So we had to set up a system where simply to get the data into a structured format, you're going to have to run it through OCR and NLP and NER, all of these terms that basically mean you can take a PDF form and turn it into a structured data set, sort of an Excel spreadsheet. In the end, the goal is to collect all of the encounters from all the providers for any individual patient and to have that available. And we're working with our data partners to do that as well. We're working with other vendors because, if you're going to your primary and then you have cancer, you're going to go to an oncologist, and you may be traveling and going to a different provider, and you may be seen by an emergency department. So I feel like that's the next step, and much quicker than I thought would happen. We got into a conversation with Synovion, and Seth showed us what he was doing, and I realized, okay, so where we first initially designed this system to work for volume, 5,000, 10,000 patients, now we see another direct use is what Seth and Synovion are doing, to be able to find up front in a trial medical records that you can use to confirm and clarify the inclusion exclusion so that you can improve the outcomes of the trial. So to me, that's the second lesson. And those two things that I said were not in my purview when I first started, and they're not the way I grew up thinking about clinical research necessarily, or even thinking about EHRs necessarily. So those are the takeaways for me from what does it mean to work and do clinical research now that we have most clinical sites having EHRs and producing data. There's always sort of one more step you have to do, but I feel like we're getting much closer to close that gap between what you have to do to get the data ready and how you can use the data to impact your trial. So from the Eligo perspective, that's what I've seen so far. And I'd like to open it back up now for a discussion for our panelists. I had a couple of questions, sort of one history and one future facing for our group. And the first question is just, we all alluded to it a little bit, but from all of your perspectives, the ideas that you're all talking about, Michael working to get this set up to run smoothly, and Doug introducing the idea of clinical research, and Seth introducing this idea of using medical records. I imagine you've all run into some change management issues, some skepticism, some concern, things like that, because we're changing the model. I'd love to hear your perspectives on what sort of thing you ran into as you're trying to do the work you're trying to do. Maybe Seth, you could start us off.
Yeah, I would. I smile, but it's a tragedy. What is enabling our adherence to this new way around requiring medical records is because we can no longer run trials in Ukraine and Russia. And there's a reason that we were running trials there, and it comes from access to medical history. And before we lost that capacity, that volume that you speak of, change management was not possible in the United States. We sought to minimize their exposure to the heterogeneous access to psychiatric care in the United States. Right. But that's not a path forward anymore. So there's a huge hurdle to change, but it got accelerated by the war.
Right. Very interesting. Doug, how about your perspective?
I always say that in this data world, it's like changing, it's like moving sands, right? And there's always a new regulation that's popping up on the radar, be it a state level or elsewhere, right? GDPR is looking at the next iteration and how is that going to affect HIPAA at the end of the day. Will there be a new standard that'll pop up on the radar, right? So I think we're always, chasing the goal a little bit. The goalpost keeps moving for us, but I think it's just being plugged in, right? I see data as a community, right? So it takes us, all of us, right, on this call, right, jointly to create something meaningful, right? It actually starts from all of us, it flows through to Seth, right? And that's sort of how I see the workflow. And at the end of the day, what I really hope for is hopefully a global standard that we can all stand on. Hey, if we can get there, that'll be magical.
Yeah, that I have to say I have been hoping for that for most of my career, but I'm still with you, Doug. I'm hoping. Michael, I was going to say you have a foot in both worlds, but actually you're in more worlds. You have more worlds you're in than feet. So from your perspective, how's the challenge been, or what do you see as a sort of resistance to overcome to get there?
Yeah, sort of wish you would have asked me before Doug, because he answered in the way that I would have answered part of my answer. And certainly anything that's new is always a challenge when it comes to change management. And in healthcare, we're always the last to change, right? In every way, it's just how we are, and it's because people's lives are at stake, right? I mean, it's just so important, right? But I'll tell you, with the introduction of the 21st Century Cures Act, it's opened up a lot of possibilities, right? And we talk about interoperability, and while it's encouraged, mandated, whatever you want to say there, many health systems are doing it, many data companies are doing it. Not all of them are enabled or ready to do it. I think Doug, you talked about FHIR. I mean, there's so many things going on right now, right? That you might say it's just a mess. So you have to figure out how to navigate that mess to be specific and know exactly what you're looking at, what you're doing, what you're pulling in. And I think that's part of the challenge. And Michael, you and Seth said it really well, used a little bit of different words around bringing the patient. And Seth, I think you took it a little bit further when you started bringing the right patient in to the clinical trials. But you got to know where you're starting and what you're doing. And if you do that, you bring the right patient in, then everybody wins, and you also avoid the AEs and other things that Seth talked about. So new is really tough for a lot of people, and you got to figure out how to navigate the sea of information that we have.
I agree completely with all the statements. A divide that I've seen is if you were able to run, if you were running a clinical trial sort of on the front end of it for the last 10 years or so, you needed to know what a medical record was in concept, in a sense. And even you've probably seen it sort of as paper, but you haven't had to be data literate, as it were. And what I see, you guys represent this right now. Data literacy as part of bringing efficacy to clinical trials. Every so often I think about the fact that when I'm in discussions with folks like you, if we laid out all the terms that we use when we're talking, I'll bet my clinical colleagues may understand less than 10% of those terms. And conversely, when they're talking about patient care and things like that, if you're on the ground working with data, when I first had my group, they understood less than 10% of the clinical terms. I had to literally recruit people that had both of those skill sets, which is very hard to find these days. So to me, I agree with all that. Change management has to do with the ability to see across from sort of being data literate over to being clinical literate. And that's something our industry, I think, is still going through, right? We used to think of technology as something we laid on top of a process that we figured out. And now we're actually understanding that if we understand the data from the beginning, we can directly influence the clinical results.
Yeah.
So,
Michael, can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that even though we've been working with real world data now for, I say a long time, 5 to 10 years, depending on who you're talking about, but long enough for many of us, why is it that every webinar you go to about using real world data, except for this one, starts with a slide defining real world data? What is it, right? That people still don't know what it is. And claims versus EHR is being used interchangeably or defined oh, it's the same. It's not the same. Or, so we have a long way to go still. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. And I think the fastest growing jobs are data scientists and biostatisticians, as a result of it. So
Yeah,
we'll get
absolutely.
there. We're in a good place.
One more comment, but either Seth or Doug, I didn't know if you any further comments on that.
Sure, I'll jump in. I do agree with your sort of aligning of all the terms and the inability to translate between the various disciplines. And another phenomenon that I think it stems from that is those that maybe don't understand the set of terms from one view to the other, we maybe on the clinical side will be like, isn't there a gadget out there that you guys can press a button? And then it's just impossible to narrow it down. And we have that on our side too, where often we refer, for example, a biomarker. We would know what we were measuring, and we wouldn't call it a marker. We would actually call what we were measuring. So there's aspirational terms, there's actual terms, and a lot is lost in translation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I fully agree. There's I think terminology is large for our business at the end of the day. And Seth, I get that all the time. They're like, hey, what? Don't you have some AI, some bot that you built, right, to translate this, right? I go, no, that's why we have data scientists and biostatisticians at the end of the day. So I think going back to Michael Fronston's point, it's an ongoing education, right? And I think everybody's learning, at their pace. I know in healthcare sometimes it's a little bit slower, but I think, and going back to Michael's point again, it all starts with the definition of what real world data is, and but I think more and more I'm seeing the definition being closer, right? Everybody's starting to speak the same language, and that's a positive, right? And so I think we're evolving, we're moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'd especially like to thank the panelists here, because I think what we demonstrate here is we're doing actual work in this area. So I encourage you to reach out to Doug and Michael and Seth about the work they're doing. I think this proves that even though it's hard, it is happening in today's world. And I'll turn it back over to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to all of our speakers for that very insightful presentation and discussion. So we've reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar and the webinar itself. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Eligo may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, you may direct them to the email address displayed on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. In addition, a survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box where you will be able to view the recording of this event, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I do encourage you to do so. Now, please join us in thanking today's speakers, Michael Ibarra, Michael Fronston, Seth Hopkins, and Doug Lee. We do hope you found this webinar informative. On behalf of the team here at XTalks, thank you for joining us. Please take care and bye for now. Thank you all once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.